Ethan Walker was no stranger to struggle. As a single father, every day was a fight to pay the bills, to keep his little girl smiling, to hold on to hope even when the world seemed determined to break him. Then, one rainy evening, fate put a stranded woman in his path. Her car had a flat, but her eyes carried a deeper weariness, one he recognized all too well. Ethan fixed her tire, refused to tip, and thought he'd never see her again. What he didn't know was that she was Olivia Sinclair, a billionaire heiress tired of being loved for her money. And what she didn't know was that she had just found exactly what she'd been searching for. But when their worlds collide, will love be enough to bridge the gap between struggle and wealth? Or will Ethan's pride and Olivia's secrets tear them apart before they even begin? Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The alarm clock's shrill beeping cut through the silence of the small apartment. Ethan Walker groaned, rubbing his face before reaching over to silence it. 5:30. Too damn early, but late enough that if he didn't move now, the day would unravel before it even began. He swung his legs over the bed, feet hitting the cold wooden floor. His body ached, a dull, familiar throb in his shoulders from hours spent hunched under the hood of cars. Bills sat in a messy pile on the nightstand, unopened. He didn't need to read them to know what they said. Past due. Insufficient funds. Final notice. A soft murmur broke through his thoughts. He turned. In the tangled mess of blankets, his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, slept soundly, her tiny body curled around a stuffed bunny, missing an eye. For a moment the weight on his chest lifted. She was the reason he got up every morning, the reason he kept pushing even when everything felt impossible. Ethan leaned down, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Time to wake up, kiddo." His voice was soft, but firm. Lily groaned, burrowing deeper into the blankets. 5 more minutes, he smirked. "I'd love to, but we both know what happened last time you got 5 more minutes. Her eyes cracked open, lips forming a sleepy smile. "I was late, and your teacher looked at me like I forgot how to read a clock," he teased. She giggled, stretching her arms out. "Carry me." He scooped her up effortlessly, holding her against his chest as he walked to the kitchen. His muscles protested, but he didn't mind. He knew there'd be a day when she wouldn't ask for this anymore. The fridge hummed when he opened it, casting a dim glow over near-empty shelves. A half-gallon of milk, 2 eggs, and a block of cheese past its prime. Not much else. He swallowed down the frustration. "Pancakes?" Lily asked, hopefully. Ethan hesitated. She didn't know they were down to the last of the batter, that the grocery money was gone, and payday was still 3 days away. He forced a smile. "You bet, kiddo." She clapped excitedly as he pulled out the mix, pretending like everything was fine. That was his job, make the world feel safe for her, no matter how much it was crumbling around him. As the pancake sizzled in the pan, Ethan's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen. Past due notice, final warning. His stomach clenched, rent. He exhaled slowly, flipping the pancake as if the weight of the world wasn't pressing down on him. "Daddy?" He turned, his smile immediate. Automatic. "Yeah, baby?" Lily's eyes were big and thoughtful. "Are we rich?" The question hit like a punch to the gut. He chuckled, playing it off. "Why do you ask?" She shrugged. "Because Tommy at school says his dad buys him new toys every week, and we don't." Ethan crouched beside her, resting a hand on her small knee. Being rich doesn't mean having a lot of toys. She thought about this. Then what does it mean? He hesitated. He could tell her what the world believed, that money was everything, that people with it moved through life untouched while people like them scraped by. But she was 6. She didn't need to carry that yet. "It means having something special no one can take away," he finally said. She considered this, then brightened. "Like you?" His throat tightened. He nodded, brushing a kiss on her forehead. "Yeah, kiddo, like me." She grinned, stuffing a bite of pancake into her mouth. Ethan turned back to the stove, swallowing down the knot in his chest. The past due notice on his phone glared at him from the counter, but he pushed it aside. He'd figure it out. He always did. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal echoed through the dimly lit garage, blending with the low hum of engines and the scent of oil thick in the air. Ethan Walker wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands stained with grease, his muscles screaming in protest. He checked the clock mounted on the wall, 8:47 p.m. His shift had ended 2 hours ago. He should be home, reading Lily a bedtime story, tucking her in, listening to her little voice ramble about school and playground adventures. But he wasn't, because rent was due, the electric bill was 2 weeks late, and the fridge at home was nearly empty. "Walker, you still alive under there?" Ethan slid out from beneath the lifted sedan, glancing toward Frank, his boss, who stood with a tired smirk and a clipboard. "Barely," Ethan muttered, pushing himself up. His shoulders ached, his back stiff from hours bent over hoods and undercarriages. Frank looked him over, then exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "You don't have to kill yourself, you know." Ethan forced a smirk. "You got another way to pay bills I don't know about." Frank's expression softened, but he didn't press. He just handed Ethan another work order. "One last one, then go home, yeah?" Ethan nodded, though they both knew he'd be back tomorrow, begging for more hours. By the time he pulled into the apartment complex, it was past 10. He sat in the truck for a moment, head resting against the steering wheel, exhaustion washing over him. The dashboard clock glowed mockingly. He had missed it. Again! He grabbed the crumpled flyer from the passenger seat. Lily's school play tonight at 6 p.m. Her first time on stage. He had promised her he'd be there. The guilt twisted in his gut as he shoved open the door, taking the stairs 2 at a time. The apartment was dark except for the soft glow of Lily's nightlight. He stepped into her room, heart clenching at the sight of her small figure curled up under her unicorn blanket, her stuffed bunny clutched tightly to her chest. Quietly he sank onto the edge of her bed, brushing a stray curl from her cheek. She stirred, her big brown eyes fluttering open. "Daddy?" Her voice was thick with sleep. "Yeah, baby, it's me." She rubbed her eyes, her tiny fingers gripping his sleeve. "You missed it." The words hit harder than he expected. He swallowed. "I know, sweetheart. I'm so sorry." She was quiet for a long moment. "It's okay." But he could hear the disappointment beneath it. "I bet you were the best one up there," he said, forcing a smile. "Did you have fun?" She nodded. "Miss Carter recorded it. She said you can watch." His chest tightened. The teacher had recorded it because she knew he wouldn't make it, because this wasn't the first time. Lily yawned, her little fingers latching onto his hand. "Will you be there next time?" Ethan felt something crack inside him. He wanted to promise, wanted to tell her yes, that nothing in the world would keep him from it, but reality had other plans. "I'll try, baby." She nodded again, but this time her voice was quieter. "Okay." Ethan sat with her until her breathing evened out, until the rise and fall of her tiny chest soothed the ache in his own. Then, slowly, he leaned down and kissed her forehead, lingering for a second longer than necessary. Then he turned off the light and walked out, carrying the weight of another broken promise. The laughter at the gala was deafening, a hollow kind of sound that echoed off crystal chandeliers and marble floors. Olivia Sinclair stood in the center of it all, a flute of champagne in her hand, a practiced smile on her lips, nodding at conversations that didn't need her voice. People surrounded her, yet she had never felt more alone. Across the room, her father, William Sinclair, the man who built an empire from the ground up, gave her a knowing look. A reminder, you were born into this world, you don't get to leave it. Olivia tightened her grip on the glass, a fresh wave of exhaustion settling over her. Another event. Another parade of people who wanted something from her, investments, favors, introductions. No one ever just wanted her. "Olivia, darling, have you considered the Kensington deal? Daddy mentioned it might be a good fit." A sleek woman in a designer gown purred, her diamond bracelet catching the light. Olivia barely heard her. The walls felt like they were closing in. The glitz, the pretense, the suffocating weight of expectation pressing down on her like an iron cage. She needed air. Excusing herself, Olivia slipped out of the ballroom, heels clicking against the marble, as she pushed through the doors and into the night. She didn't stop moving, not as she pulled off the earrings that felt too heavy, not as she tossed the clutch onto the passenger seat of her car. For the first time in years, she didn't tell security where she was going, didn't call her driver, didn't check her schedule. She just drove. The city lights blurred as she sped down the highway, past the towering skyline and the familiar streets lined with million-dollar homes. It wasn't enough. She pushed the car harder, turning off onto the smaller roads where the neon glow faded and the silence stretched. Here, no one knew her name. No one whispered behind their hands about inheritance and stocks. No one looked at her and saw dollar signs. For once, she was just another woman on the road alone. The truth hit her like a punch to the gut. I don't even know who I am without the money. The thought settled heavy in her chest as the rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, beating against the windshield in steady rhythm, and then the jolt. A violent pull to the side, a sinking feeling in her stomach. She gripped the wheel, heart slamming against her ribs as the car sputtered, warning lights flashing angrily on the dashboard. A flat tire. Of course. She let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through her perfectly styled hair as she leaned back against the seat. Here she was, a billionaire, sitting on the side of an empty road in the middle of nowhere, completely and utterly helpless. Maybe, she thought, she had been helpless all along. The rain came down in sheets, hammering against the windshield, blurring Olivia's reflection in the rearview mirror. The hazard lights flickered in the dark, casting an eerie glow against the wet pavement. She gripped the steering wheel, breathing through the frustration curling in her chest. Of all the nights, of all the roads, it had to be this one. She checked her phone. No signal. Perfect. Outside, the rain turned violent, wind whipping through the trees that lined the empty stretch of highway. The city lights were miles behind her now, swallowed by the night. For the first time in her life, she felt small. She exhaled, pressing her forehead against the steering wheel, debating whether she should step out and attempt to change the tire herself. How hard could it be? Then again, she'd never had to do anything herself. A pair of headlights cut through the downpour. A truck rumbled closer, slowing as it approached. Her pulse spiked. The world had taught her not to trust strangers, but right now, she didn't have much of a choice. The truck rolled to a stop behind her. The engine idled for a moment before the driver's side door creaked open, and a man stepped out of stream, pulling his hood over his head against the rain. Olivia tensed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his jacket soaked within seconds. His boots splashed against the wet pavement as he approached. When he got closer, she could see his face, rugged, sharp jaw, piercing blue eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He didn't speak at first, just assessed the situation like he'd done this 1,000 times before. "You all right?" His voice was deep, steady, cutting through the rain like it had weight. She hesitated, then nodded. "Flat tire." He glanced at her, then down at her shoes, heels completely soaked. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Yeah," he said. "I figured." She bristled, but before she could respond, he was already moving, crouching beside the car. "No spare?" She hesitated again. She didn't know, he sighed, shaking his head, muttering something under his breath before standing. "Look, you're not getting anywhere in this storm. I can give you a lift, or I can patch this up enough to get you moving." Olivia studied him. He didn't ask for her name, didn't seem to recognize her. There was no flicker of that all-too-familiar greed in his eyes. He was just helping. A strange feeling settled in her chest. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. The man glanced up, rain dripping from the hood of his jacket. because you're stuck in the middle of nowhere, in the pouring rain, and I'd rather not wake up tomorrow and see your face on the news." A dry laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. The first genuine reaction she'd had all day. She should have been terrified. But somehow, with this stranger fixing her tire in the middle of a storm, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Safe. Olivia reached into her bag, fingers brushing against the crisp $100 bills she always carried. She barely thought about money, never had to. It was a solution to almost every problem she'd ever encountered, and after what this man had just done for her, it felt like the least she could do. The storm had eased into a drizzle by the time Ethan tightened the last bolt on the spare tire. He wiped his hands on his jeans, standing with a stretch, his breath visible in the cold air. "All set," he said, nodding toward the car. "Should hold up until you get to a shop." Olivia exhaled, relieved. She had no idea how long she would have been stranded if he hadn't stopped. She pulled a few bills from her wallet and held them out. "Thank you. I really appreciate it." Ethan glanced at the money, then back at her, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to do that," he said. Olivia blinked. She thought maybe he hadn't understood. "I insist, really." He let out a small breath through his nose. "I'm sure you do." He turned slightly, moving toward his truck like the conversation was over. She frowned, stepping closer. "You helped me. I just want to—" "You don't have to pay me to be a decent person," he interrupted, his voice calm but firm. The words landed harder than they should have. She had never met a man who turned down money, ever. People who said things like, "It's not about the money," usually meant it's not about the money, unless there's a lot of it. But this man, who didn't know her, who had spent nearly an hour in the freezing rain fixing her tire, was walking away. She looked at the bills in her hand, then back at him. "I just don't want you to think I'm ungrateful." Ethan turned, finally meeting her gaze. "You said thank you," he said simply. "That's enough." Something about the way he said it, like it was just obvious, made Olivia's stomach tighten. She had spent her entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from her. But this man had walked into a storm, helped a stranger, and then walked away like it was nothing, like she was nothing special. She wasn't sure why, but for the first time in a long time, she liked the way that felt. Olivia watched as Ethan climbed into his truck, the old engine rumbling to life. He barely spared her a glance as he put it into gear, like their entire encounter had been nothing more than an errand, a passing moment in his day. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, mist curling in the glow of her headlights. She should get in the car. She should drive away, pretend this was just another forgettable inconvenience. But her feet didn't move. She had met countless men who smirked and charmed, who measured their words carefully, who made their admiration clear the second they knew her name. Ethan Walker hadn't asked her name, hadn't cared who she was, hadn't wanted a damn thing from her. And now he was just leaving. She caught a glimpse of him through the truck's rain-streaked window, his strong profile, the tired way his fingers gripped the wheel. Then he was gone, taillights fading into the night. For the first time in a long time, Olivia felt something strange, something she couldn't quite name. She got into her car, gripping the steering wheel, but didn't start it right away. Her hands were still cold, but not from the rain. It wasn't often that people surprised her. The world had made her believe that kindness always had a price, that generosity was just an investment, expecting a return. But Ethan, he had stopped in the storm, helped her, refused her money, and disappeared like it had never happened. A man like that didn't just exist. She exhaled, shaking her head. This was ridiculous. It was nothing. Just a small, fleeting moment in the middle of nowhere. And yet, as she pulled onto the road, the city lights growing closer in the distance, her mind kept drifting back to piercing blue eyes, to strong hands covered in grease, to the way he had said, "You said thank you. That's enough." She had never met a man who didn't want more, but something told her she would meet him again. The bell above the auto shop door jingled as Olivia stepped inside, the scent of motor oil and metal thick in the air. The place was smaller than she expected. No gleaming corporate logos, no sleek office spaces. Just tools, grease-streaked floors, and the steady hum of engines in the background. She had found him. It had taken longer than she thought. She had no name, just the vague memory of an old truck, a rough voice, and piercing blue eyes that had haunted her for days. But she was Olivia Sinclair. When she wanted something, she found a way. Now that she was here, though, she wasn't sure what she was doing. She had told herself it was curiosity, that she just wanted to say thank you properly, but deep down, she knew that wasn't the truth. Across the shop, Ethan was bent over a car, his back to her, broad shoulders tense as he worked. His sleeves were pushed up, exposing strong, calloused forearms streaked with grease. He wiped his hands on a rag, then turned. For the briefest second, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe even recognition. But it was gone before she could be sure. "Can I help you?" His voice was the same, steady, unshaken. She took a breath, pulling herself together. She couldn't exactly tell him she had tracked him down like some desperate socialite searching for a man who didn't want her money. "My car's been making a noise," she lied, folding her arms. "Thought I should get it checked out." He studied her for a moment, unreadable. "You sure about that?" She blinked. "What do you mean?" "You don't even know what kind of noise it was," he said. She opened her mouth, then shut it. "Damn." Ethan sighed, tossing the rag onto a nearby workbench. "Pop the hood." She hesitated, then did as he said, stepping aside as he leaned over the engine. She should leave, get back in the car, drive away, and forget this whole ridiculous impulse. But she didn't. Instead, she watched him work, watched the way his hands moved with quiet confidence, the way he focused, unbothered by her presence. For once in her life, she was in a room with a man who wasn't trying to impress her, and she had never felt more out of her depth. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion settling deep in his bones as he flipped through the pile of overdue bills on the kitchen table. Electric, rent, Lily's school fees, all stamped with urgent red warnings. He sighed, leaning back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. Every month the numbers felt heavier, the gaps harder to fill. He had picked up every extra shift he could, but no matter how hard he worked, he was always just behind. The door creaked open, and Lily padded in, dragging her stuffed bunny behind her. "Daddy, someone left a bag at the door." His brows furrowed as he stood, following her to the entrance. Sitting just outside was a paper grocery bag, the kind from the expensive market across town. Inside, neatly packed, were cartons of milk, fresh fruit, boxes of pasta, and a loaf of homemade bread, stuff he hadn't bought, stuff he couldn't afford. His jaw tightened. He scanned the parking lot, but there was no sign of anyone. No note, no explanation. Just a silent offering, as if someone knew exactly what he needed, but didn't want him to know where it came from. He didn't like it. The next day, it was Lily's teacher who dropped the second bomb. The school was able to process the remaining balance on Lily's fees, she said, with a kind smile at pickup. Anonymous donor. Ethan's stomach twisted. He forced a nod, muttering a thank you, but his hands curled into fists. Someone was helping, someone with money. He already had a damn good idea who. Later that night, Olivia sat at the back of the small cafe near his shop, stirring her coffee, watching through the window as Ethan locked up for the night. She had seen the way he carried himself, the exhaustion in his shoulders, the way he hesitated when handing over his debit card at the gas station. He was barely holding it together. And yet he still stood tall, still refused to ask for help. She had more money than she could ever spend in a lifetime. What was a few groceries? A school fee? It meant nothing to her, but to him, it was everything. So why did she feel like she had just made a mistake? The little diner on the corner wasn't the kind of place Olivia Sinclair usually found herself. No crisp linen tablecloths, no curated playlists humming in the background, no sommelier waiting to pour a glass of something imported and expensive, just the smell of fresh coffee and fried food, the soft clatter of silverware, and the occasional burst of laughter from the kitchen. It was comfortable. And strangely, she liked it. Ethan sat across from her, rolling up his sleeves as he reached for the menu, his calloused hands covered in faint smudges of grease. He didn't seem out of place here. This was his world. A world of late-night diners, worn-out booths, and black coffee that probably tasted like motor oil. She still didn't know why she had said yes when he had casually mentioned grabbing a bite after work. She could have made an excuse, could have walked away, but she hadn't. Now she sat there, watching as he studied the menu like he hadn't already memorized it, waiting for him to make the first move. "You're looking at that like you're about to make the hardest decision of your life," she teased. He smirked. "You don't just choose between the bacon cheeseburger and the country fried steak, Olivia. You weigh your options carefully." She laughed, shaking her head. "You sound serious about this." "Damn right," he said, flipping the menu closed. "You don't mess around with diner food." The waitress came by, filling their coffee cups before taking their orders. Olivia watched as Ethan thanked her, with the same warmth he gave everyone. No pretense, no performance. He made people feel seen. It was something she had never experienced. "So," Ethan said, leaning back in his seat, "what's your story?" She stiffened slightly, expecting the usual questions. "What do you do? Where do you live? Who are your parents?" But he just looked at her, waiting. Actually waiting. She hesitated, then set down her coffee. "You ever feel like you were born into the wrong life?" His brow lifted slightly, but he didn't laugh, didn't dismiss her. He just nodded. "Every damn day." She exhaled, something inside her unraveling. No one had ever answered that way before. For the first time in her life, someone was listening to her, not the billionaire, not the heiress, just her. Ethan sat in his truck, staring at the half-empty parking lot in front of him, the engine idling. The day had been long, filled with oil changes, broken parts, and angry customers. But it wasn't the shop that weighed on him now, it was her. Olivia Sinclair. She had come into his life like a storm, with her sharp eyes, the way she carried herself like someone who had nothing to prove, yet somehow everything to lose. They had shared a quiet evening at the diner, a simple meal, and he had laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months, maybe longer. But now, sitting alone in the dark, it all felt like a mistake. She was from a world he couldn't understand. She drove a car worth more than his entire apartment. She had more zeros in her bank account than he could ever hope to see in his lifetime. And yet she liked him. She saw something in him, something he couldn't quite grasp. And that scared him. He had spent years building walls, protecting his heart, protecting Lily, protecting everything that mattered from people who had nothing but empty promises and hidden agendas. And Olivia? She wasn't like the others. She wasn't playing some game, wasn't pretending to be someone she wasn't. But that didn't matter. The truth was, he wasn't good enough for her. His phone buzzed on the seat next to him, another bill reminder, another sign that he was barely keeping things together. He had nothing to offer a woman like her. No luxury, no smooth words, no quick solutions to the problems he faced daily. All he had were his hands and his pride. And right now, that didn't feel like nearly enough. He slammed his hand on the steering wheel, the frustration boiling over. She had to know, she had to see, that there was no room for someone like her in his life. But as the engine hummed, as the rain began to patter softly on the roof of the truck, his thoughts kept drifting back to her. The way her smile had lit up the diner. The way she had listened, really listened, when he spoke. Maybe this wasn't a mistake. But deep down he knew the truth. Falling for her would only make the eventual heartbreak that much worse. He couldn't let that happen. Not again. With a sharp exhale, he started the truck, put it into gear, and pulled away, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he couldn't have. Ethan had just finished wiping down the workbench when he heard it, the faint cough from the other room, followed by the unmistakable sound of a small body retching. His heart skipped a beat as he dropped the rag and ran toward Lily's room. "Lily!" He pushed the door open, his stomach sinking as he saw her, sitting on the edge of the bed, pale and trembling, her little hands clutching her stomach. "Daddy, it hurts," she whispered, her voice weak and strained. Panic shot through him like an electric shock. He knelt beside her, brushing a sweaty lock of hair from her forehead. Her skin was hot to the touch, feverish. His mind raced, scrambling to figure out what to do. Call the doctor, get her checked, make sure this isn't serious. He had always known this could happen, but the weight of it hit harder than he expected. He was already stretched thin, barely scraping by, already behind on bills, with no savings to fall back on. The last thing he needed was an emergency hospital visit, but this wasn't a choice. This was his daughter. "Hold on, baby. I'll take you to the doctor, okay?" His voice shook as he lifted her into his arms. She was light, too light, and his chest tightened at the thought of what might be happening to her. They made it to the truck, Ethan's heart pounding as he drove toward the hospital. The lights of the city were a blur in the rain, and the only sound inside the truck was Lily's soft, labored breathing. He had no idea how he was going to pay for this. Another emergency bill, more debt, more things stacking up. It was all too much. He could barely keep up with the rent, let alone pay for an ER visit. His phone was already filled with overdue notifications, and the thought of adding more on top of that made his chest tighten, his breath short. At the hospital, he rushed through the doors, his feet pounding against the cold tile floor. Nurses rushed toward him, taking Lily from his arms, but all he could think about was how he was about to lose everything. His pride, his daughter's health, his chance at holding on to something. As they disappeared into the emergency room, Ethan stood frozen in the hallway, his back against the wall, his eyes closed as he fought to keep it together. His hands trembled as he pulled out his wallet, empty. His phone buzzed again, with another reminder of what he couldn't pay. He couldn't breathe. "Please," he whispered to himself, "please let her be okay." The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and cold metal, but the air around Ethan felt thick, suffocating. He sat by Lily's side, his hand clasped tightly around hers, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest as she slept. The doctors had given her something for the fever, but they hadn't been able to tell him what was causing it. His mind raced through worst-case scenarios, but he forced himself to push those thoughts away, focusing on her steady breathing. But all he could think about was the overwhelming weight of the bills piling up. Medical bills, rent, Lily's school fees. He couldn't escape the numbers pressing against his chest, demanding attention. He had no idea how he was going to make ends meet, no way to even begin paying what was coming. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a reminder from the electric company, one more bill he couldn't pay. He ignored it, shoving the phone back into his jacket. "Everything's going to be fine," he whispered to Lily, even though the doubt gnawed at him. The next morning, as he was getting ready to leave, a nurse approached him with a clipboard, a slight frown on her face. "Mr. Walker?" "Yeah?" His stomach clenched. "There's an issue with the bill." He stiffened, trying to mask the panic rising in his throat. "What do you mean?" "I'll take care of it." The nurse hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Someone's already taken care of it." Ethan blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" She handed him a piece of paper with a receipt stamped across the top, his name, the hospital charges, and a note, paid in full. He scanned the document again, the disbelief coursing through him. "Who paid this?" The nurse gave him a polite smile. "I'm afraid I can't disclose that information, but it's all been taken care of." He felt a sick, icy grip tighten around his chest. Someone had paid the bill. But who? And why? He tried to shake it off, but the questions followed him as he left the hospital, his mind racing. His eyes flicked to the text messages that had been stacking up on his phone, calls from creditors, notices. The money wasn't there. But somehow, someone had stepped in. He couldn't make sense of it. He knew the world wasn't kind. People didn't just give without expecting something in return. And yet, there had been no name, no explanation, just a strange, silent gesture that felt more like a weight than a relief. Who would do this? And more importantly, why? Olivia sat across from Ethan, the weight of her confession pressing down on her chest like a stone. She had promised herself she would tell him, finally be honest about who she was, about everything she had kept hidden. She could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at her, like she was just another woman passing through, offering empty gestures of kindness that meant nothing. But she had to tell him. He deserved the truth, no matter how it might shatter whatever fragile connection they had. Her fingers trembled as she stirred her coffee, the steam rising in the dim light of the small cafe. Ethan's hands rested on the table, his eyes focused on her, but there was an unspoken distance between them. She could feel it. They were getting closer, but something kept pulling them apart, and she knew it was because of the lies she had been telling. Ethan, there's something I need to say." Her voice faltered, but she pressed on, determined. He glanced up, the confusion in his eyes giving way to concern. "What is it?" She hesitated, her throat tightening. She had never felt this exposed, this raw. For the first time, she didn't want to hide behind her wealth, behind the walls she had built around herself. I'm not who you think I am," she said, the words escaping in a rush. "I've been pretending Before she could finish, Ethan's hand shot up, his voice low but firm. "Stop." His face had hardened, a flicker of something darker crossing his features. "I know where this is going, Olivia. I get it. You feel sorry for me. You think I'm some poor, helpless guy, and you're trying to fix it. But that's not what I need." Her heart sank. He wasn't letting her speak, wasn't even giving her a chance to explain. "Ethan, no. It's not like that. I'm not some charity case," he snapped, his words sharper than she expected. His eyes burned with frustration, with something that almost felt like betrayal. "I don't need your help, your money, your pity. I don't want it." She recoiled, the sting of his words hitting harder than she expected. She had come here, vulnerable, hoping he would understand, hoping he would see the truth. Instead, all he saw was a woman trying to fix his life with her wealth. Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm not interested in being saved." She watched him walk away, her throat tight, the lump of unspoken truths lodged somewhere deep inside her. She didn't know what she had expected, maybe understanding, maybe something else entirely. But this was the last thing she had anticipated. Olivia stood at the window of her apartment, the city lights outside blurred by the rain streaking down the glass. Her fingers gripped the edge of the windowsill, her reflection staring back at her. But it didn't feel like her. Not anymore. She had come to a realization, something she couldn't deny any longer. Ethan was slipping away from her. She had known it for a while now, but the truth had never felt more suffocating. The walls between them had grown higher, thicker, and every attempt to get closer seemed to drive him further away. His anger had been sharp, raw, and in a way she understood it. But she also knew that the longer she kept her secrets, the further he would pull. She couldn't keep pretending. She couldn't keep hiding. The lies had been easy at first. A little distance here, a little half-truth there. The more she was around Ethan, the more she realized how different her life was from his. She lived in a world where every problem had a solution: money, power, status. But with Ethan, everything was real. Everything was earned. But that was the problem. He had no idea who she really was. And he was beginning to resent the parts of her life that had made her who she was. She had seen it in his eyes when he walked out of the diner. She had heard it in his voice when he told her he wasn't some charity case. He wasn't asking for help. He didn't want her money. But what if she couldn't give him anything else? What if her truth was the one thing that would drive him away forever? She knew she had to tell him. But telling him meant losing the last of her control. It meant showing him the side of her life she had hidden for so long, the side that was built on privilege, expectation, and a kind of loneliness that no amount of money could cure. It meant showing him that the very things he despised were the things that had defined her existence. Her heart pounded in her chest. The decision was gnawing at her. She had felt it every time she looked at him, every time he smiled that easy smile or laughed at her jokes. She had tried to be someone else for him, someone worthy of his love, his time, but now, she realized, that wasn't enough. If she didn't tell him now, she might lose him forever. But if she did, she feared she'd lose him just the same. With a deep breath, she turned away from the window and grabbed her coat. The weight of the truth hung heavy, but she couldn't keep running from it. She had to face it. She had to face him. But as she walked out the door, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. Whatever came next, whether it broke them or set them free, she wasn't sure they would ever be the same again. Ethan had never felt so stupid in his life. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut, the realization cutting through him with brutal clarity. The moment Olivia stepped into the auto shop, standing in front of him with that smile, that laugh, he had thought, he had believed, that she was just a woman who didn't care about his background, who saw him for what he was. A mechanic, a father, a man trying to make a living. But that wasn't who she was. He had been working under the hood of an old truck when the conversation came up, and just like that, it slipped out. Olivia Sinclair, daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the country. The name rang through his mind, and suddenly everything came rushing back in sharp focus. The way she had casually dismissed her expensive car, her effortless charm, her ability to buy anything she wanted. The expensive taste, the clothes, the way she never seemed to worry about anything, like money was a mere afterthought. His hands froze as the wrench slipped from his fingers, clattering to the ground. He couldn't believe it. She was everything he had tried to avoid. She was everything he couldn't have. His stomach churned as the realization hit harder, deeper. The hours they'd spent together, the late-night talks, the quiet moments when they had shared pieces of themselves. He had believed it was real, but it had been a game to her, a distraction from her perfect preordained life. Everything was a lie. He hadn't even given her a chance to explain before his anger boiled over. "How long were you planning on keeping this from me?" The words came out harsh, sharper than he intended. "How long were you going to pretend to be someone you're not?" Olivia flinched, her face falling, but Ethan couldn't stop himself. The hurt, the sense of betrayal, it burned too hot. "You knew what this was. You knew I wasn't your world. I'm just some guy you pitied, aren't I? Some broken mechanic to pass the time with?" Her eyes widened with pain, but she didn't speak. It didn't matter. The truth was out now. Ethan turned away, his hands clenched into fists, his heart racing. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't stand the way she made him feel like a fool. "Don't," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "Just don't try to explain. I can't listen to it." She stepped forward, but he held up a hand, the anger still fresh in his veins. "I thought you were different," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I thought you actually cared about me." But that wasn't possible, was it? He wasn't the kind of man someone like Olivia Sinclair would care about. And now, as the silence hung between them like a storm, he realized how much he had truly lost. Ethan's hands trembled as he stood there facing Olivia, the silence between them stretching longer than he could bear. His mind was racing, his chest tight with everything he couldn't put into words. The anger that had flared earlier had cooled, but in its place, a deeper, more insidious emotion had settled. Hurt, doubt. A kind of bitter realization that he had been a fool to ever think someone like her could love someone like him. Olivia stood in front of him, her eyes wide with shock, confusion, maybe even fear. He could see the pain in her face, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered now except that one undeniable truth that had burned through him like a fire. She was from a world that wasn't his. "I don't want your money," he said, his voice low but filled with finality. "I never did. And I don't want your pity either. I'm not some project for you to fix." Her lips parted, but he didn't give her a chance to respond. He couldn't listen to her explain. He couldn't hear her try to justify it. "You think I don't see it? You think I don't see how your life's been built on that, on money, on power, on the kind of life I can't even touch? I'm not that guy, Olivia. I don't belong in your world." The words felt like they were ripping through him, each one a reminder of everything he couldn't be. He wanted to reach for the truth, to make her understand, but the truth hurt too much. "I don't care about your money," she finally said, her voice shaky but strong. "Ethan, I care about you. I care about us." He laughed, but it wasn't a sound of joy. It was hollow, bitter. "You don't get it. You can't get it. You live in a world where money solves everything, where it's easy to fix people, to buy your way through anything, but that's not real. You don't get to just step into my life, make everything feel like it matters, and then walk away when it's too much for you." He turned his back on her, unable to look at her anymore, afraid that if he did, he might let his guard down, afraid that if he let her see how much he wanted this, how much he wanted her, he would lose himself. "I'm not asking you to save me," he said, his voice strained. "And I'm not going to pretend I'm someone I'm not, just to fit into your world." Olivia's silence pressed down on him, suffocating him, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he was drowning. He couldn't let himself fall for her, not like this, not when their worlds were so far apart. He couldn't let her love him if it came with a price he wasn't willing to pay. Olivia stood there, frozen in the silence that followed Ethan's words. The pain in his eyes was undeniable, but the wall he had built around himself was even more impenetrable. Every word he spoke felt like a new wound, deeper and sharper than the last. She had tried to reach him, tried to break through the distance between them, but he wasn't having it. He had already decided. "I can't do this," she whispered, the weight of his rejection crashing down on her. She had never felt so small, so invisible. He had pushed her away, and now she was left standing in the ruins of what could have been. He didn't even look at her as she turned toward the door. She had told herself she wouldn't cry, wouldn't let him see the devastation that was tearing her apart. But as she reached for the handle, her chest tightened, and her vision blurred. She had loved him in a way she hadn't loved anyone in years, but love, it seemed, wasn't enough. "You don't get it, Olivia." His voice came from behind her, and she flinched, her hand on the door trembling. "I'm not the guy you want. You're used to people who can give you everything, but I don't have that. I don't have the life you need." She closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. She wanted to turn around, to beg him to see her, to fight for something they could build together. But the truth was, she couldn't do it alone. She had given him everything, her honesty, her vulnerability, her heart. And he still refused it. The door clicked shut behind her, the finality of it echoing through her mind. Outside, the cold air bit at her skin, but it was nothing compared to the sting inside her chest. She had hoped he would fight for them. She had hoped that maybe, just maybe, the connection they shared was strong enough to overcome the differences between their worlds. But it wasn't. As she walked away, her heart heavy with the weight of a love she couldn't have, she realized something she had been trying to ignore. Love wasn't enough. Not when one person refused to fight for it. And now, as she stepped into the night, her heart shattered into pieces, and the space between them felt wider than ever. Ethan slammed the hood of the car shut, his fingers numb from the cold metal, but he didn't feel it. His mind wasn't on the engine or the worn-out parts. It was elsewhere. He wiped his hands on his grease-streaked rag, staring blankly at the garage floor. Every movement felt mechanical. His shop, the steady hum of the engines, the weight of the tools in his hands. It was all supposed to make him feel grounded. But nothing could fill the emptiness where Olivia used to be. He hadn't seen her in days, and the silence in his life had never been louder. The space where her laughter used to echo, where her gentle presence had calmed the chaos in his head, was now just a hollow void. He tried to focus on the work, tried to throw himself into the tasks that had once been enough to occupy his every thought. But his mind kept wandering, his thoughts always returning to her, to what could have been, to the look in her eyes as she walked out of his life. He grabbed another wrench and turned back to the engine, but the movements were slow, deliberate. He couldn't shake the weight of his own pride. He had pushed her away. He had chosen to believe that he wasn't worthy of someone like her, someone who could give him everything and still want to be with him. "Daddy?" Lily's small voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see her standing at the edge of the shop, her face scrunched in concern. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. She didn't return it. Her tiny hands were clenched at her sides, and her big brown eyes searched his face, a depth of understanding in them that startled him. "You're sad?" she said simply. Ethan's heart sank. How could she see it? He had been trying so hard to hide it from her. But there was no hiding from Lily. She always knew. "I'm okay, kiddo," he said, kneeling down in front of her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Just tired, that's all." She nodded, but he could tell she wasn't convinced. "Is it because of Miss Olivia?" The name hit him like a punch. He hadn't even realized how much he'd been avoiding saying it. Olivia. It felt like a lifetime ago that he had kissed her, that he had thought he could build something real with her. "I miss her," he said softly, not realizing until the words came out how much he had needed to say it. Lily wrapped her arms around him, her small body fitting perfectly against his. "I miss her too." Ethan closed his eyes, the sting of unshed tears threatening to break through. He couldn't explain to Lily why he had pushed Olivia away, why he couldn't let himself need her, even though every part of him did. But sitting there, with Lily's arms around him, he realized something. He had lost more than Olivia. He had lost the part of himself that had been whole when she was there. And now he wasn't sure how to put the pieces back together. Ethan sat at the worn-out counter of the small diner, his fingers absently tapping the edge of his coffee mug. The rain outside beat against the windows in rhythmic desperation, mirroring the turmoil in his chest. He had tried everything to move on, to keep busy, to drown out the hollow ache that had followed Olivia's departure. But no matter how many cars he fixed, how many long hours he worked, nothing could fill the void she had left. The bell above the diner door jingled as the familiar shuffle of footsteps entered. Ethan didn't need to look up to know who it was. His old mentor, Hank, walked in with the same slow, deliberate gait he always had, his graying hair and thick glasses betraying the years that had passed since Ethan had last seen him. Hank didn't say anything at first, just pulled out the chair across from Ethan and sat down with a grunt. They both knew why he was there. "You've been avoiding me," Hank said, his voice rough, but with that unmistakable warmth. Ethan let out a breath, pushing his coffee aside. "I don't need advice, Hank. I'm fine." Hank raised an eyebrow, then reached for his own cup of coffee, taking a slow sip before placing it down with deliberate care. "You're a stubborn one, aren't you?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Hank leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "You know, I've seen you work yourself into the ground for years. You've done it all on your own, always pushing forward, doing things the hard way, and you've got nothing to show for it except exhaustion." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, but Hank didn't flinch. "I'm not saying you're weak, Ethan. Hell, you've got more strength in you than most men I've met. But real strength, that's knowing when to accept help." Hank's gaze softened, his voice gentler. "You've spent so much time trying to protect yourself, trying to make everything work by yourself, that you've forgotten what it means to lean on someone when you need it." Ethan's throat tightened as Hank's words cut through the layers of pride and anger that had built up inside him. He had always believed that asking for help was a sign of weakness, that relying on anyone else meant losing control. But sitting there, looking into Hank's steady eyes, he felt the weight of the truth press down on him. "I don't know how to fix this," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to Hank. Hank's gaze softened even more, a quiet understanding in his eyes. "You don't have to fix everything alone. Sometimes letting someone in is the bravest thing you can do." Ethan's chest tightened, his mind spinning with the weight of the words. He had pushed Olivia away because he couldn't let himself need her, but maybe, just maybe, he was wrong. Maybe real strength wasn't about carrying the weight by himself, it was about trusting someone else to help him carry it. For the first time in days, a small seed of hope flickered in his chest. He wasn't sure how to make things right with Olivia, but maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to do it alone. Ethan sat on the worn couch in the dimly lit living room, his eyes fixed on the floor as the weight of the past few days pressed down on him. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, the tension in his muscles making it hard to breathe. He had tried to keep it together for Lily, tried to be the strong father she needed, but everything had fallen apart. Olivia was gone, and no matter how much he wanted to fix it, he couldn't undo the damage he had caused. The sound of small footsteps broke through to the quiet. Ethan looked up to see Lily standing in the doorway, her little figure bathed in the soft light of the hallway. She was holding a stuffed bunny in one hand, her eyes wide and concerned. She had been unusually quiet all evening, and he could see the sadness in her face. "Daddy?" Lily's voice was soft, almost hesitant. Ethan managed a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, kiddo, what's up?" Lily hesitated for a moment, then walked over to him and climbed onto the couch, snuggling up close to his side. "Are you sad?" He swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump in his throat. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired, that's all." She didn't seem convinced. She looked up at him, her eyes as big as saucers, and for a moment she reminded him so much of her mother, so full of love, so full of hope. She wasn't old enough to understand everything that had happened, but she could feel the shift in the air. "You're sad because of Miss Olivia, right?" she asked, her voice small but full of the honesty only a child could have. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't said Olivia's name since she left. The pain was still raw, still fresh, and he didn't know how to explain it to her. But here she was, asking the question he had been avoiding. He nodded slowly, fighting the tears that threatened to fall. "Yeah, baby, I miss her." Lily took a deep breath, as if she were about to say something incredibly important. "But you know what, Daddy?" He looked at her, surprised by the certainty in her voice. "What, sweetheart?" She smiled up at him, her little hand resting on his. "Love isn't about money. It's about finding someone who makes your heart feel full." Ethan blinked, the words catching him off guard. For a moment the weight of everything lifted, just slightly, as he looked at his daughter, his beautiful, innocent daughter, who somehow understood something that he hadn't been able to grasp for himself. His chest tightened. She was right, of course. It wasn't about the things they didn't have or the worlds that were so far apart. It was about love, pure and simple. The kind of love that made everything else seem insignificant. The kind of love that made your heart feel full, no matter the circumstances. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "You're right, Lily," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's about love. And I'm sorry I forgot that for a while." Lily snuggled closer, pressing her cheek against his, and for the first time in days, Ethan felt a spark of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe he could find his way back. Olivia stood in the center of her apartment, her suitcases open on the floor, clothes scattered around her like fragments of a life she no longer recognized. The room, once filled with the hum of laughter and the softness of shared moments, felt eerily quiet now. She had spent hours packing, moving between each item with the mechanical precision of someone who had already made up their mind. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She had come to the city to escape the suffocating expectations of her life, to be someone different. But in the end, she realized she couldn't outrun her past. Ethan had shown her a world she had almost forgotten, a world where love wasn't tangled up in wealth and status, where kindness mattered more than connections, where people didn't just see her as Olivia Sinclair, the billionaire heiress. They saw her as her. But that world wasn't hers. Not really. She stood by the window now, looking out over the skyline, the same view that had once felt like freedom, but now it felt like a cage. She had fallen for Ethan, But the more she had allowed herself to love him, the more she had realized the truth. She didn't belong in his world. He had pushed her away, and maybe she deserved it. She had lied to him, kept parts of herself hidden because she was afraid that if he knew the truth, he would see her for what she really was, a woman with everything who still felt empty. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. She had built a life of wealth and comfort, but in doing so, she had built walls around herself. No matter how much she wanted to believe otherwise, she was still the same person who had everything, but had never truly belonged anywhere. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she picked it up without thinking. It was a text from her father. The message was simple, just a reminder about the next event. A gala she had been avoiding. It was the kind of message she used to answer without a second thought. But now it felt like a chain. She set the phone down and walked to the door, her fingers lingering on the handle. Maybe she wasn't meant for a simple life. Maybe the life she had built, the one with all its expectations and pressure, was all she could ever know. She wasn't strong enough to leave it behind, not really. And maybe she had never been meant for someone like Ethan, someone who was honest and real and didn't see the world through the lens of power. With a deep breath, she stepped out of the apartment, the door clicking shut behind her. The weight of everything she was leaving settled in her chest. The truth was, she wasn't just leaving the city, she was leaving herself. Ethan stood in the doorway of his shop, his hand still resting on the frame as the sound of her footsteps faded into the distance. The door was cracked open just enough that he could hear the low hum of the city, but it wasn't the noise that filled his mind. It was the absence of it. Olivia's voice, her laughter, the way she had made everything feel brighter, more alive. Those sounds were gone now, swallowed by the silence she had left behind. He hadn't gone after her, he hadn't called her, hadn't begged her to stay, because somewhere deep inside he had believed that it was better to let her go. She deserved someone who could give her the world, someone who wasn't broken. But as he stood there, staring at the empty street where she had walked away, he realized how wrong he had been. Pride. That was what had driven him to push her away. The belief that he wasn't enough, that he didn't deserve her, someone who had everything, someone who could live a life filled with luxury and ease. He had been so damn stubborn, so caught up in his own fears, that he hadn't seen the truth. Love wasn't about money or status. It wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about choosing each other. He had built walls around himself, convinced that he could keep everything together if he just did it all alone. But the truth was, he hadn't been protecting himself. He had been isolating himself, pushing away the one person who had made him believe in something more than just surviving. His heart ached as the realization crashed into him, sharp and undeniable. He had let her go. He had let her walk out of his life because his pride was more important than the love she had offered him. The sound of the engine in the distance grew louder as Olivia's car passed by the shop, and in that moment, Ethan knew he had lost her. For good. The door clicked shut behind him, but he didn't move. He stayed there in the cold, the weight of his mistake sinking in with every passing second. And for the first time, he felt it. How empty his life had been without her, how much he had missed. He had let pride cost him the one thing he truly needed, her love. And now, standing in the darkness of his own choices, he couldn't help but wonder if it was already too late to fix it. Ethan could feel the nervous energy thrumming in his chest as he stood outside the Grand Hotel, the lights of the charity gala shimmering like stars in the distance. His hands were shaking, and he could feel the weight of every step as he made his way toward the entrance. This wasn't him. He wasn't the type to make grand gestures, to throw himself in front of a room full of strangers, to open up his heart for everyone to see. But this time, he couldn't hold back. He hadn't planned on doing this. He hadn't even known if she would be there. But he had to see her. The thought of her walking out of his life, of losing her forever because of his stupid pride, was something he couldn't live with. He couldn't just sit by and let her go without fighting for it. The lobby was elegant, filled with people in tuxedos and gowns, their laughter and conversations echoing off the marble floors. Ethan spotted Olivia immediately. She was impossible to miss. She stood at the center of the room, speaking to a group of well-dressed men and women, her presence commanding the attention of everyone around her. She was radiant, flawless, but to Ethan she looked so distant, so unreachable. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward her, ignoring the curious glances from the crowd. He could feel the eyes on him, the whispers behind his back, but he didn't care. This was about her. This was about showing her that he had been wrong, that he was ready to be the man she deserved, no matter what the cost. "Olivia," he said, his voice firm, cutting through the conversations around her. She turned, her expression unreadable, as she locked eyes with him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a small, tentative step forward, Ethan took her hand, the crowd falling silent around them. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low but clear, carrying through the room. "I was a fool to push you away, to believe that love had anything to do with what I could give you. You're not here because of what you have. You're here because of who you are. And I love you, Olivia, not because of your money, not because of your name, but because you make me feel like I'm enough. You make me feel like I matter, and I'm not walking away from that." He watched as her eyes softened, the hardness in her face melting away. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her response. But in that moment, the world didn't matter. It was just the two of them. "I know I'm not perfect," Ethan continued, his voice thick with emotion, "but I'll spend the rest of my life showing you that you're everything I need." Olivia stood there staring at him, her lips trembling as if she were fighting to say something. For a long, heart-stopping moment, it felt like everything was hanging in the balance. And then she took a step forward, closing the space between them, her hand reaching up to touch his face. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered, and in that moment, everything Ethan had feared, the distance, the walls, began to crumble. Olivia stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, as Ethan's words lingered in the air, heavy with truth and vulnerability. She had been bracing herself for the worst, an apology, an explanation, maybe even a declaration of love. But this was more than she had ever expected. She had spent so many nights convincing herself that she was better off alone, that she didn't need him, that the walls between them were too high to ever scale. And yet, here he was, standing in front of her, raw and honest. The kind of honesty she had always longed for, but never thought she could have. Her hand still hovered near his face, her fingers trembling as she searched his eyes. The pain of everything they had been through, the distance they had both created, still stung deep inside, but it was nothing compared to the pull she felt toward him now, the fear, the doubts, the insecurities, everything that had held her back, everything that had told her to walk away, suddenly felt irrelevant. "I was scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the room. She had kept this buried for so long, but now, in this moment, it felt like she had to say it. "I was scared that if I let you in, you'd see who I really am, and you wouldn't want me anymore." Ethan's expression softened, his hand reaching out to take hers, his thumb gently tracing the back of it. "Olivia, you don't have to be afraid. I see you, all of you, and I love you. Not because of who you are or what you have, but because of who you make me feel when I'm with you." A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time it wasn't from pain, it was from relief. The weight that had been crushing her heart for so long, the fear that had kept her from truly believing she could be loved for who she was finally beginning to lift. Without thinking, without hesitation, she stepped into him, wrapping her arms around him tightly, holding him like she never wanted to let go. Ethan responded instantly, pulling her close, his embrace warm and steady. There, in his arms, she felt like everything could finally be okay. She didn't need to fight anymore. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his chest, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have trusted you. I should have let you in." Ethan pressed his lips to her forehead, his grip tightening as if he were trying to hold on to the moment, to make sure they didn't let go. "You don't have to apologize," he murmured, his voice thick with love and tenderness. "We're here now. That's all that matters." In that moment, the world outside felt irrelevant. They were no longer trapped by the fears, the lies, the things that had once kept them apart. They had finally found each other again, and this time they were ready to face whatever came next, together. The sun had barely risen when Ethan stepped outside, the cool morning air biting at his skin, as he took in the familiar sights of his small neighborhood. The old truck sat parked on the curb, the same one he had driven for years, and the streets were quiet, as they always were at this hour. But today it felt different. Today, everything felt like it was on the edge of something new. His hands were covered in grease, as usual, and the smell of gasoline lingered on his clothes, but there was a sense of peace in the air that hadn't been there before. He hadn't expected this life, the one that was right in front of him, messy and imperfect, and beautiful in ways he could never have imagined. He turned toward the front door where Lily was already pulling on her shoes. She had her backpack slung over one shoulder, her tiny face lit up with excitement. It was the first day of school after the holidays, and she couldn't stop talking about seeing her friends again. Ethan smiled as she bounced over to him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the kind of certainty he had been missing for years. "Ready to go, Daddy?" Lily asked, looking up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. He nodded, squatting down to tie her shoes. "You bet. Let's get you to school, kiddo." As they walked out to the truck, Ethan glanced across the street where Olivia stood at the foot of her front porch, a mug of coffee in her hands. She was looking at him, her eyes soft but full of something deeper, something he hadn't seen in the past. Something that told him everything was finally going to be okay. Their worlds had been so different, so far apart, that it seemed impossible they could have ever truly been together. But here they were, standing on the same ground, not as two people from different worlds, but as two people who had found each other in the chaos of life. Olivia smiled and waved, and he returned it, the weight of all the doubts and fears he had carried for so long slipping away with that simple gesture. They were building something together, and it wasn't about the money or the status. It was about the quiet moments, the shared smiles, the way Lily laughed when they played together at the park. They didn't need the world. They had each other. Ethan started the truck, the engine rumbling to life, and they drove off, the road ahead stretching out in front of them. It wasn't going to be easy, they both knew that, but this time they were ready. Together. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, the familiar scent of oil and metal clinging to him, as he worked on yet another engine. His shop was small, barely enough space for the work he loved. But it was his. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was starting to build something that could actually last. But even so, the weight of it all still sat heavy on his shoulders. He was doing everything he could to keep the place afloat, but some days it felt like it wasn't enough. The phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw Olivia's name. She hadn't called in weeks. After everything that had happened, he hadn't expected to hear from her again. He stared at the phone for a moment, unsure if he was ready for whatever she had to say, but after a long hesitation he picked up. "Olivia?" he said, his voice rough from a long day of work. "Ethan." Her voice was steady, but there was something in it, something that made him sit up straighter, as if he were bracing for a storm. "I've been talking to some people, some investors. They're interested in helping you expand your shop. You're not alone in this anymore." Ethan's stomach twisted. "What do you mean? You don't have to—" "I'm not giving you money," she interrupted, her voice firm but kind. "I'm connecting you with the right people, people who can help you get the shop to where you want it to be. This is all you, Ethan. You've earned it." He could feel the disbelief settling into his bones. He had fought so hard to get this far on his own, always doing it all by himself, never relying on anyone. And now Olivia was offering him a chance to grow, to make something of himself that didn't depend on her wealth, but on his own skill, his own passion. It felt like a dream. "I don't know what to say," he breathed, the weight of it sinking in. "I never thought—" "I know you didn't," she said softly, her words a balm to his bruised pride. "But you don't have to do this alone anymore. It's your time, Ethan. You've worked for this." His throat tightened as a wave of emotion hit him, a combination of gratitude and disbelief. It wasn't just about the investors or the opportunity. It was the realization that someone, she, believed in him. He stood there in the quiet of the shop, the engine forgotten for a moment, the weight of the world lifting off his shoulders. He wasn't alone, not anymore. "Thank you," he whispered, knowing that words could never truly express the depth of what he felt. The line went quiet for a second, and then Olivia spoke again, her voice a little softer. "Go get your dream, Ethan." And for the first time in a long while, he believed it was possible. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet street, as Ethan stood in front of the small shop he had worked so hard to build. The sign above the door read, "Walker's Auto Repair," but to him, it meant more than just a business. It was the culmination of years of sweat, hard work, and a dream he had almost let slip through his fingers. Now, standing in the fading light, he realized that the real dream wasn't the shop, wasn't the success. It was the life he had built with Olivia, with Lily, with a love that had finally found its way into his heart. He felt the familiar weight of a box in his pocket, the small velvet case that had been burning a hole in his jeans for weeks now. He'd never been the kind of man who needed grand gestures, never believed in making a spectacle out of something so deeply personal. But this moment, was different. Olivia had stood by him when he thought he had nothing to offer. She had believed in him, had given him a chance when he had nothing to show for it but a small shop and a handful of broken-down cars. Her love had never been about the money or the life he couldn't give her. It was about choosing each other, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. He walked slowly to the back of the shop, where the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the small garden they had planted together. Lily was at school, and for the first time in a long time, it was just him and Olivia, the two of them, standing in the quiet of their world. When she stepped outside, he didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, his heart beating faster than it ever had. She was standing in front of him, her smile soft, her eyes filled with that warmth he had come to love. "I know I'm not perfect," he started, his voice rough, the words catching in his throat. "I've made mistakes, but I know one thing for sure. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Olivia. Not because of what I can give you or what I don't have, but because I love you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple silver ring. "I'm not offering you anything flashy, no big ceremony, no $1,000,000 mansion. Just me, and whatever we decide to build together." Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at him, her hands trembling as she reached out to take the ring. "I don't need anything else," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're all I've ever wanted." Ethan slid the ring onto her finger, his heart swelling as she looked at him, a smile breaking through the tears. In that moment, he knew they had everything they needed. The rest was just the beginning. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in his hands, his eyes wandering to the window where the sun was just beginning to rise. It had been a few months since the shop had taken off, since the moment he realized that he could have it all, not the wealth, not the success he had always dreamed of, but something far more valuable. He had his family. He had Olivia. He had Lily. And that was more than enough. Olivia walked into the kitchen, her hair still damp from the shower, her smile soft as she caught his gaze. The light in her eyes hadn't dimmed since that first moment they had come together, the moment he had admitted that he loved her. Now everything felt like it was falling into place. They had built a life together, brick by brick, with their own hands and hearts. Lily was in the living room, sitting on the floor, surrounded by schoolbooks and papers. Her laughter echoed through the house, and Ethan smiled, the weight of the past lifting with each innocent giggle. There was a time when he thought he couldn't provide her with what she deserved, but now he had something even more important to offer: love, stability, and the promise of a future where she could always count on him. "You're quiet this morning," Olivia said, sitting down across from him, her hand resting on his. "What's on your mind?" He squeezed her hand, the warmth of her touch, grounding him in the present. "Just thinking about how lucky we are," he said softly, "how far we've come. I never thought I could have this, a family, a real future, with you." She leaned in, brushing a kiss against his cheek. "It's not luck, Ethan. It's love. The kind of love that doesn't come from money or status. It comes from choosing each other day after day." He nodded, his heart swelling with pride. Love. That was the greatest fortune of all. And together they were building something that would last: a life, a home, a family. There would be struggles ahead. There always were. But he knew one thing for sure: as long as they had each other, nothing else mattered. He looked at Olivia, his heart full, and whispered, "I wouldn't trade this for anything." And for the first time in his life, he felt like he had everything he needed: